Yesterday I was playing soccer and I realized how I need to actually control my anger as somebody just grabbed my hand, and I don't know, for some reason I had just exploded at them. And I will look forward to the next speaker, who is Alistair Moes, who is the founder of Moes Anger Management. Alistair actually co-leads Moes Anger Management, Healing and Anger, serving diverse clients from business leaders to the homeless community since 1989. Since 1989, you're kidding.
I'm old.
Okay, I guess it does pay to control your anger. His approach addresses underlying emotions behind anger, helping individuals transform their reactions. A passionate advocate for parenting, especially fathers. Alistair also conducts workshops for various professional groups. Thank you so much for coming here. This is the left hand, but here you are, and here's the mic.
Okay. Thank you so much. Loving what I'm hearing so far today, and I really appreciate the work that Yusuf is doing with his team and everybody. So my name's Alistair, and my last name is pronounced Moes, even though it's not really spelled like that. It's spelled M-O-E-S. It's Dutch. That's what I got to grow up with because my dad came here from. He grew up in Holland, and I've been running these anger management groups for the last 25 years, 28 years actually, and there's a team of 10 of us. So there's a whole group of us, and we have worked with many thousands of people. And anger is, crosses every boundary. Anger does not discriminate whether you're playing soccer or anything else. I've coached soccer when my kids were young, and it happens in parents more than the kids actually. But so the work we do, the thing that jumps out at me is that we have all these different counselors from different backgrounds, and the groups we do are really multicultural. It doesn't matter where you're from, whether you're rich or poor, whatever your background is, everybody ends up experiencing anger in one way or another. I'm guessing for you guys, but for myself, for sure. And also, I'm in a multicultural relationship. My partner, Alejandra, is from Ecuador, and she has her roots go back to Europe, but also in the indigenous peoples in Ecuador and in South America as well. And I think one of the things that the people that attend our groups, and we do groups for women as well as for men, Alejandra runs the women's groups, is that the diversity is something that connects people. The diversity is something that people appreciate. And whenever people call us, usually there's been some big blow up. People really rarely ever call us just to be preventive. People don't call the anger management guy unless something really significant has happened. Sometimes the police have been involved. Sometimes their partner is saying, you got to do this, or, things aren't going to work out here. Most people come on their own, and most people, it's about relationships. So what do people do in these relationships? Well, that all comes out. But in that moment, when they're reacting poorly, in that moment, the people are very disconnected, right? We don't hurt people around us if we're connected to our heart, if we're connected to the higher reasoning part of the brain, if we're thinking things through, we're going to know better. We're also disconnected from what's in our body, our intuition, our gut feeling. And so I really appreciated hearing what Norm had to say here earlier, and what Yusuf and other speakers had to say, because what I think the work we do is helping people come back to themselves. And when people come back to themselves, They connect with their heart, their head, their intuition, their gut feeling, and then they start to connect with the people around us. When people come to us, we talk about all the things that happen, and we talk a lot about science, about what happens in the body, what happens in our brain, all the changes and the hormonal changes, the chemical changes that happen in the body. But ultimately, what happens is people are just being run by that part of themselves that just wants to win. Sometimes we call that the ego, that part of us that has to get our way, be heard, be seen, be right, that competitive, ambitious part of us. And it's not a bad part of us. It just doesn't do a very good job if we leave that part running the show, right? The ego needs to be balanced by our heart, our head, you know, what's in our body. And when there's that balance, then somebody can be really competitive and ambitious and still be a good person. Right? There's lots of examples out there where people are competitive and ambitious and not good people. Because I think the people that are actually really connected to themselves, they don't create the headlines so much. And they don't tend to go to anger management as much either, because when we're connected to the people around us, we tend to see that bigger picture and not hurt them. And I have personal experience, you know, when I think about what led me to do this kind of work, it's because of disconnection. You know, I grew up in a household where nobody talked about anything. And way back in 1979, when I was 18 years old, my mom very suddenly died. Like literally, one day she was alive, the next day she was gone. And my dad, in his infinite wisdom, love you, Dad, he's not around anymore, but he didn't talk about it. And we didn't have any family around us. And whatever family was out there, I didn't really hear from them. It was 1979, and he didn't have a funeral. Like, that's how much we didn't talk about it. And so I had this really profound experience of just avoiding, just not talking about things. And I knew that was wrong at some level. I didn't realize it at the time. And I ended up going to, well, I went to UBC and got kicked out of there, but that's another story. And I ended up going to SFU and getting a degree in psychology while bartending. And bartending is a great way to disconnect. You know, I had a lot of fun, but it wasn't very responsible. And eventually I thought I should get a job that was more like an adult job. And so ended up, you know, doing a whole bunch of work in psychology. But in 95, I started running these groups. And so I've spent the rest of my adult life just talking to people about the things that they don't usually talk about. And it doesn't matter what your background is, most people avoid talking about the shame and the pain and those uncomfortable things that happened when you were a kid, happened in your family, and we just pretend like everything's fine. So I've got more stories around that, but I had some really profound experiences around that, and then started doing more therapy and learning more, because I could see how disconnected and lonely the men were that typically came in and spoke with us. And so that just inspired me. And you know, now I'm 62 and I keep on taking more training and doing things to keep on learning and be more connected with myself. And the work we do in our groups with men and with women, ultimately that's what it's about. It's about helping people connect more deeply with themselves. And part of the work we do is in leading our groups, and in the books we've written on this, is create opportunities where other men or other women get to hear from each other. Right? When people, at the end of the first session of the group, one of the things that happens is we'll do a checkout, and I'll say, just say one or two words. What's your experience after this first 2 hours? And somebody will always say, well, it's good to know that I'm not the only one. I'm not alone, right? And I think this is one of those profound things where they experience that, and then after the next couple of sessions, they're hearing from other men or women. They're hearing about what works. Now we present all sorts of stuff around the science, and I'm a storyteller, if you haven't figured that out yet. And they get to hear from what doesn't work, but also what does work. And often I think the power of the group is that people get to hear other people who are in the moment, in situations often like they are, that are doing things that make a difference. And so there's people in the group, when they speak, it just has more of an impact. And I think one of the other things we talk about a fair bit is what it feels like, because we have to be connected to our body when we do this work. So when I'm talking with men about what's behind the anger, usually some combination of pain, emotional, sometimes physical, shame and fear and sadness and loss and all of these things, it's with a group of men who typically have very much disconnected from their bodies. And I know about this. I mean, coming from a family that did that and bartending for many years. Because if we're disconnected from our body, we can't really connect to somebody else. And so we work with people to get increasingly more connected with their body so that they recognize, they feel the fear, it's often a constriction in their chest. Whereas the anxiety, sometimes up here, but often in the belly. Or the grief or the loss often is a weight up and down the core of the body. And physically, it feels like a weight. And the responsibility sometimes, men, when they take on too much, or women, when they take on too much, that we carry in the shoulders, or that turns into pain in our back. The anger people hold in their jaw. Often, when people start to bring awareness to these things, then they're more likely to do something. But if we're numb from this within ourselves, then we can't feel it in others. So a lot of the men after that first session, we go through all of this stuff, and I say, so your challenge over the next week is to notice what happens in you when the emotions rise up, where you feel that in your body, and what are the thoughts that come up in your head as you do that. For instance, if people say to their partner, you always, or you never, that's usually a sign that they should stop and take a break. Because the obvious response is, that's not true, and the argument is on. And as the argument goes on, both people escalate. Both people, their heart rate goes up, their blood pressure goes up, the tension builds, and they're escalating up towards the number 2 in this graph above us. And you can see that as people in general escalate, their quality of judgment is dropping. The more we escalate, up at the top of that number 3 is when we are going fully into fight or flight. And in those moments that lead people to call us, in those moments we are our dumbest. Come on, you've all been there, right? Everybody's been in that moment where you're feeling the most emotion. And typically this is where if we have a history of trauma in our background, and pretty much all of us have, you can tell because there's been a moment where something about this big happened, but your response is like this, right? So the response is completely disproportionate to the event. Usually means there's something going on in the body. And usually that thing in the body has risen up and taken us over. I mean, it's still yours. You're still responsible for it because it's your history. Sometimes it's your parents' history, or there's science that shows this can go back generations and have an impact in our DNA and stay with us until we acknowledge it, until we choose to do something with it. Ideally, we know about our history, and then we can acknowledge that and we can do something with it. But if, like in my family, people just disconnect from it, then it will continue to run us, and we will pass that on to the next generation, typically. So men come back to session number 2, and they'll say, things are going a little better. And usually that is because they've been connecting more to what's happening in their body. They've got a whole bunch of information about what happens when we escalate, and they're aware of what they're doing with their head, what they're doing with their thoughts. And the instruction is, notice this within yourself and others without judgment, just with curiosity. You're going to spend the next time just noticing these things. And when people take the time to notice this, they tend to not react. They tend to think it through more. Not all the time, but it's more likely that they're going to think it through. And then we can cut this off, or we can stop sooner. Even when people come back to the group the second week and say, oh man, I lost it again. I'm embarrassed about what I did. Most of the time, I'll say, okay, so was there anything different that you did? And most of the time, they'll say, well, I caught myself quicker. I didn't go as far down that path. And I apologize sooner, whatever it might be. And so we focus on that. It's like, all right, we just need to build on this. We're not expecting perfection. But if there's growth, if we're learning, then we can get somewhere. Now, once we get up to this number 2 here, you can see our quality of judgment has dropped. Up at that number 2, whereas at the number 1, there's all these possibilities. By the time there's a number 2, it's like you've got the blinders on. Everything becomes very black and white, all or nothing. Survivalist. Once we've escalated to that point, you're still capable of stopping and walking away. But most people in that moment, their thinking is just that place where it's very black and white. When I think about hatred, I think it's at this point and above that number 2, where it's just ego, where we're disconnected from our body, we're disconnected from the higher reasoning part of the brain. And when we go into fight or flight, that's exactly what happens. Because our body is acting as if we are living in caves 50,000 years ago. And we're staring at a wild animal, and that wild animal is a threat to our survival. And in that moment, the higher reasoning part of the brain is not going to serve us. We don't need to philosophize about life or death because we're in a life or death moment. We need to just react in that moment. And so we're left with a very ancient part of the brain that's just all or nothing, right? Fight or flight, just survivalist, which will serve us because it works a lot quicker and it helps us survive. In that moment, because we've gone into fight or flight, all our pain receptors have deadened. So this will serve us because whether we fight or flee, this will help us. But the downside is that we're probably just talking with somebody we really care about. And in that moment, because we've escalated so much, typically because of trauma in our background, and when that's running us because we haven't addressed any of it, that's taking us over, and this ancient part of the brain is just running us. And it's just going to try and survive. So whatever's happening, because now we're up at the number 3 and our quality of judgment is at the lowest, unless you add alcohol, and then it plunges even lower. And we've shut down the higher reasoning part of the brain. Well, the body does. And when it does that, we're not as intelligent. It even shuts the part of the brain down that develops memory. So even without alcohol, people's memory can get really choppy in those really intense moments, or you can blank out because we've escalated all the way up and we're just in that survival moment. We're disconnected from our heart, and so we're just, we don't feel the love or the care. We also don't feel the shame, right? Every emotion, anger included, has a constructive, has a reason for being. Same with shame. We feel shame when we hurt somebody we love. We go, oh man, what did I do that for? That doesn't feel good. Usually you feel it right around the solar plexus. So in this moment, with the shame, we can collapse around it and feel awful, or we can hold ourselves up and go, okay, I'm not going to do that, or it'll help stop me do that, or I'll go, oh man, I got to go apologize. I need to, it's like the adult part in us. But in this moment, when we're escalated way up there, it's like this really young part of us is in charge. That's just all or nothing. So emotionally, the more we escalate, the more our emotional maturity level drops. Right? We escalate enough, we typically get down to, what do you think? 4, 3, 2, right? A 2-year-old, developmentally, it makes sense that they're going to have a temper tantrum. But somebody who's, older than that, or an adult, or a youth, it doesn't make sense that they're having a temper tantrum. And if they're having that temper tantrum, it's something in them. It's something from their history, typically, that's running that. And so often, historically, if somebody's just doing anger management and they're teaching them, as we do, about breathing, about meditation, about all these things to calm the body, and we have lots of different things that we help people with that actually brings your heart rate down, that pulls you back. But unless we're dealing with what's historically in our body and in our family history, we're not going to be able to change that. That's still going to rise up in us. So by the time we're up above that number 2, well, this ancient part of the brain is running us, and it's like there's a toggle switch. It's all or nothing, fight or flight. And what happens with that is that, so I'll tell you another story. And this is related to trauma, because we're all animals. And imagine there is a full-grown cheetah, and it's chasing a small young gazelle. And that gazelle is separated from the herd. It's alone. And as that cheetah catches it, as it's just about to sink its fangs into the back of that gazelle, the gazelle just falls down as if it's dead. So there's fight or flight, but there's also freeze. There's actually another one called fawn, but I'm going to stick with freeze for right now. Now, For the gazelle, all of its pain receptors have deadened, so it doesn't feel the cheetah bite into it. And it just falls down as if it's dead. Its pain receptors have deadened, so it doesn't feel any of that, and it just lies there frozen. And the cheetah, well, the cheetah thinks it's dead. The cheetah's not going to, mangle the thing. The cheetah just thinks it's dead. And some predators won't eat an animal, like some bears won't eat an animal that just falls dead like that. But a cheetah will, but it doesn't mangle it. It picks it up and maybe it drags or carries it back to its lair. Now, this is a last-ditch survival response. And maybe the cheetah gets distracted by some lions or some other predators, has to put the gazelle down. Puts the gazelle down, and maybe the gazelle gets a chance to get up and take off. If it does, it runs back to the herd, goes to the very middle of the herd, and the whole gazelle will just shake. Now, when it fell down in that freeze mode, it's like all this energy. The adrenaline's on full, it's like the gas is on full, and the brakes are on full, trapping all this energy in it. When it gets back to the middle of the herd, the safest place it can find, the whole animal just shakes. Shakes for a period of time, and it's like a really good therapy session. It's just like, poof, everything moves through it. It feels okay after that. Because that's what animals do, they're not self-conscious. Whereas, for instance, soldiers come to mind. The other people that come to mind are nurses. I think they deal with a lot of trauma as well. But a soldier who gets traumatized in battle ends up going back and is in a safe place at the end of the day. The same thing happens that happened to that gazelle. It feels all of this energy rising up in it. Heart rate typically goes up to 150 to 200 beats a minute. And it starts to be, that soldier ends up becoming overwhelmed with emotion. Maybe the emotion starts through the chin, and that shaking that the gazelle allowed to happen, because the gazelle isn't all self-conscious. The gazelle isn't, oh, what are all the other gazelles going to think if I start shaking, right? They just shake. So for the soldier feels all this and is like, what's going on? Nobody taught me about this. They just taught me to suck it up, tough it out. And so the soldier goes and isolates himself somewhere, or herself. The soldier tries to put a clamp on all that energy trying to move through him, and maybe goes and smokes some dope, drinks, or things that are really effective at numbing all this in them. Fentanyl, heroin, various other things. So they're way more likely to isolate themselves and to use some sort of drug to calm themselves down. So clearly what they need is training and connection. Like, I think that's the theme that I hear so much today. They need connection. But most of the time, people are coming to see us because they escalated past that number 2. They were run by their ego, and they blew up. They weren't in flight mode. They weren't in freeze mode. They were just in fight mode. But eventually, that blow up ends, and they're coming down that other side. Their heart rate's coming down. Their blood pressure's coming down. They go below that baseline and feel emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, and typically go into a depression, right? The emotions are overwhelming. Either they go into sadness and feeling remorse, regret, shame, anxiety, fear. And if they have a history of distracting themselves from all those uncomfortable emotions, that's when they're most likely to go and drink or drug, or cheat on their partner, or watch porn, or play video games, or whatever it is that they do, gamble, to escape those uncomfortable feelings. And if they escape those, then they don't learn anything. We have to stay close enough to the emotions that we feel the shame, but not so close that it takes us over. So at number 5, that's where learning happens. But most people don't learn there. They just do whatever they've done in the past, whatever that's done in their family in the past. So when people come to see us, usually they have not been sleeping well or eating well or taking good care of themselves because they've been so focused on all the problems. And part of what has to happen is they need to bring that baseline down into something healthier, where they start meditating, they start getting out into nature, they start looking after themselves, they start reconnecting with things that inspire them, people that inspire them, and they go to anger management. Hopefully that helps. I could go on, but I think that's probably enough for today. Anyway, thank you. Last thing is at Moes Anger Management on any social media, or at Healing Anger for the Women's stuff.
I was just about to do that. Thank you for doing that. So just to explain, so you'll remember Moes Anger Management, Google it. And Alistair also has a great book. I remember the tagline, "Lose Your Temper," right? That is such a great one. I think that's something beneficial. And, basically these materials, these resources, these expertise, these lived experiences, that's what today is about. It's really to share with everyone, like, what we've learned, what we've done, and we have them here if you guys want to take a look quickly, just to see what the content, which is incredibly valuable for us, is too. So I appreciate it. Thank you for the amazing work you're doing, bro. Yeah. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Real work to heal the world, guys.